At dawn the sea around White Harbor wore a skin of pewter, puckered and cold. Oars bit it in a rhythm Yara could hear in her bones. Iron scraping iron, breath on breath. The old song of men who had grown up with salt in their teeth. The black wind slid like a shadow among heavier northern cogs, and the city's pale marble walls rose before her, wet with mist and the gulls' patient filings. Theon stood near the prow, hunched in his cloak. He left a fingerprint of sweat on the carved kraken when he touched it, and when he noticed, he pulled his hand away as if he'd burned himself. He did not look at the white-walled city. His eyes skittered over it, as if any shore might open and show him the bolt-studded door of a kennel. "Breathe," Yara told him softly. "In. Pretend it's just weather." He gave a twitch that was almost a laugh. "The last time you told me that was outside the Dreadfort. And I was right. The storm passes, if you keep breathing." Yara caught the eye of Torgon Pike at the steering oar and gestured. The men bent to their work. The Ironborn knew their oars as a mother knew a child's weight. The black wind obeyed. White Harbor's outer harbor was waking. Fishmongers on the quays, cords creaking. A dockside boy, blue-lipped and barefoot, chasing a dog with a loaf of bread between its teeth. The sea ran brown-green along the pilings, frothing white where it caught on stone. The city smelled like brine and old wine and something buttery drifting from an open window that made Yara suddenly, fiercely hungry. The Manderleys had sent word that Jon Snow would be met here, not at the wall, and it would be Wyman Manderley himself who heard their proposal and judged whether to let them upriver on the White Knife. Manderley seals had always been fat, the tail went, and Wyman had taught each to hold a pen. Why him? Theon's voice came thin in the wool of his hood. Jon Snow. Why not ride to Winterfell itself? "Because the Boltons hold Winterfell," Yara said, keeping her gaze forward. Between the quays she picked out the new castle rising behind the waterfront, its banners a deep green against the morning, the white merman thick-bodied and smiling as though he had a secret kept in his belly. "And because the North gathers here, food, coin, ships, everything that moves in White Harbor first, and Lord Manderley has hands in more pies than a feast day cook." "I've seen that cook," Theon murmured. "He keeps his pies under his cloak." "Good. If he bites, I'll bite back." Yara tugged her cloak's clasp against the wind, an iron kraken cold on her throat. If the tales are half true, Snow's left his vows. If he's free of them, he can marry. And if he can marry, I mean for him to marry me. Theon flinched, but it was not laughter that escaped him this time. His pupils shrank, as if the morning had suddenly brightened. "You marry Jon Snow. If it saves my men from Euron and saves his from the Boltons. If it gives him ships and me a crown. And you'd marry? Yara, you don't." "I don't need to want someone," she said, calmly as she could. "I need to win." The taste of brine came, hard at the back of her throat. What she liked in bed and whom she'd kissed under a spray of oars was not fit to be called to account by a world that measured a woman's worth in wombs and the weight of her ankles. And he's said to be stubborn. Stubborn men make good partners if you can teach them which way to be stubborn. Theon's jaw tensed. "He was kind to me when we were boys. Not kind in the way of songs, but simply not cruel. Someone ought to be." She clapped his shoulder, then went to the rail as a signal horn blew from the quay. Northmen in sea-worn cloaks waved. One banner, blue and green, showed the white merman of Manderley. Another, drab-gray, bore a pale wolf's head. The sight of the dire wolf tugged at some old memory of the mainland. Shaggy gods of the wood stairs peering through snow, the smell of pine pitch and wet fur, and the steadiness of ground that didn't rise and fall beneath your feet. The black wind kissed the pier. Lines were thrown, caught, made fast. Yara descended between her oarsmen in a hush that went through them like a hand. She wore her good leather, the one with the sea silk stitching young Harag's lover had made for her, and she had cleaned her boots herself for the first time in years. She would not go to bargain with her soles white with salt. Wyman Manderley waited with a dozen men about him and a pot-bellied scribe who looked like a jug. Lord Manderley took a step forward, and his belly took one, too. He wore his wealth without apology. Green velvet, ropes of pearls, and on his cloak a clasp shaped like a leaping merman who looked a great deal more fit than his lord. When he smiled, dimples cut deep as tide channels into his cheeks. "Lady Greyjoy," he said, voice syrup-thick, "this harbor has seen Ironborn only on days of grief. I pray you mean to change that." "Lord Manderley," Yara said, bowing her head, "we've brought more than grief if we're allowed to. Ships, sigils, swords, and honor." A man behind Manderley had stepped forward. His face looked as if it had been carved out of the hull of a storm-tossed ship. He wore the stark gray, but the badge on his breast marked him as a steward no boyhood had ever softened. A small silver knife, plain and wicked. "Do the Ironborn bring honor too?" "I bring hunger," Yara said crisply. "Hunger for Euron's throat. Hunger for a seat that isn't stolen at knife point. Hunger for a chance to break the Boltons the way we break a sea ice that traps our hulls. If you have honor to trade for that, we'll be sated enough." "Davos," Manderley said, in a tone that suggested he cut the air into slices when he spoke the name. "Lord Davos Seaworth keeps strange company for a man who once trimmed sails for a different king." Davos inclined his head. His hair had been salted nearly to white. His eyes were like old rope, frayed, but still holding. "Stranger than Ironborn in White Harbor, my lord? Not this year." "Not this year," Manderley agreed. He put out a hand. The fingers had rings as wide as oarlocks. "Come then. Snow waits inside." "Jon Snow." Theon's voice was sand-dry. Davos turned his head to squint at him. Theon's hood had fallen back. "Greyjoy, is it?" Davos said quietly. He made no move to draw a blade or spit a curse. Only the set of his mouth changed. "You've see hunger too, I think." "I have hunger for a good long sleep," Theon said. "I won't find it if Euron's alive." "A fair wish." Davos gestured, and they crossed under a stone arch stamped with a merman's grin. The new castle's audience hall had the warmth of a kitchen. Yara felt the heated stone through the soles of her boots. The dais was plain. There was a chair on it that looked like it had been built for a man's back rather than his pride. Jon Snow stood in front of it, not in it, and something in Yara's head clicked with that. He was narrower than the songs that had begun to cling to him. Men made monsters out of men who did not weep when others did. He wore black without mud, but not the black of the wall, that had its own smoke. His hair was bound back, not oiled, and the fur at his shoulders looked like it had been worn by wolves before it ever warmed human bone. He looked like a man who did not believe there would be a tomorrow but intended to make one anyway. And when he saw Theon, a change passed through him like weather rolling in from the sea. Theon's shoulders crushed down. "Jon," he said, and then more softly, as if they were boys again and he was sneaking into a tack room to sleep off a cup of stolen wine. "Snow." Jon stepped forward. He did not embrace Theon. He did not call for the chains. He held his shadow-straight voice to a line and said, "You've come north again." "I never left," Theon said, strangled, and fell quiet. Yara looked between them and decided not to wait. "Lord Snow," she said, stepping into the spacemen left when they did not know what to do with pain. "You know what happened on Pike. You know what sits there now. You know what my uncle is. I know he kills his kin for sport." Jon's eyes were the Arctic side of gray. "Yes, and I know a storm when I smell one. We fled with what we could carry. Men, ships." My captains muttered, "But they follow the wind who can read it, and I can. I can read this one too. You don't take Winterfell back without the White Knife's mouth, and even if you do, how long do you keep it while your coasts bleed and your grain burns? You think to stop the bleeding?" It was the man with the storm-carved face, Davos Seaworth, who spoke, gaze sharp as a marlinspike. "I think to make a pact," Yara said. "A short word for a long thing, a knot that binds two ropes into one. Your north bleeds men and needs ships. My isles bleed men to a madman and need a name to rally under. We can solve both. I want what my uncle craves. I'll have it with ink and vows instead of knives." "What is it you ask?" Jon asked. Yara set her jaw. "Recognition. If we help you throw down the flayed man, you pledge the North's voice for me at any moot. You'll name me Lady or Queen of the Iron Islands, if you've a taste for that word and an ear for how to make it carry. And more than that, you'll seal it with a marriage. The hall breathed in collectively. Marriage, John repeated carefully. I'll bind the Ironborn to you with an oath that won't wash off. Her mouth tasted like metal, but she didn't let it show. I'll marry you, Jon Snow. Manderley coughed, a sound like a cork half loosing and then changing its mind. Davos's eyebrows climbed. Theon stared at the far wall like a man telling himself a story that made sense of a rope and a stool. We've our gods to reconcile, Yara went on, and our customs. The old songs say we keep salt wives. The mainland says we keep none of our words. But I'm not my uncle. I've seen what comes of men who take what they want and call it a law. This marriage would be a joining of the ships and the snows. You need the sea. I need the shore. The rest. She lifted one shoulder. We'll decide it without singers in the room. Jon looked at her as if the world had abruptly stopped in front of him. It was not shock precisely. It was the care of a man whose next step might crack the river ice. I swore vows once, he said quietly. I kept them until I died. Then you paid your price, Yara said, and the wall kept none of its men from the knives in their backs. You're not bound to a corpse. He blinked. She saw something like pain move under his skin like a fish under ice, and then it was gone. You speak plainly. I'm shy like that. She grinned and felt her face crack with it. If you'd prefer riddles, you've the wrong queen. Queen. Davos rolled the word in his mouth and did not spit it out. Manderley's heavy rings clicked together. A bold pledge. An impossible one, some might say. I've noticed impossible things have been happening, Yara said. Some of them put a blade in the back of men who were trying to keep this world from turning to bone. Others walk on the sea ice and bring winter down out of season. If you want to argue grammar with me when the sea's freezing in autumn, we can. After, Manderley said and rubbed at his chin. I like this one, he told Jon. You would, Davos muttered, not unkindly. Jon crossed to the window and stood there so long that the frost made of his breath another windowpane. Yara let him have it. Men who commanded truly did not enjoy being cornered. She looked at Theon instead. The shorn edges of him were visible to her in the way he held his arms at his sides, as if he were still trying to take up less space. She knew that lesson. The sea had taught it to her young. Learn the size of your ship and never pretend you're larger or you'll scrape a reef. At last Jon turned. If we agreed, he said, you would do more than send ships to the harbor and call yourself ally. I would put men ashore where you ask, Yara said. I would carry your ravens. I would take back Deepwood Mott from the Boltons and hand it to its own. And I would cut Euron's throats one by one until the last man left in the islands can breathe without tasting fear. Deepwood, Davos said. That'd sit well with Lord Glover. Good, Yara said. I like to hand back what we took at our worst. Better than handing back the dead. More than that, Jon said. You would, he exhaled. You would ferry the free folk south, if there are still any to ferry. Bring them by sea, land them at the White Knife and the Bar Rollins, anywhere we can feed them and keep them from freezing. They fought for me. I'll not leave them to the cold because the coast isn't yours. Yara thought of the men she'd hauled over gunnels in winter gales, the dead weight of a body that had given up, and the sudden lightness when they started to fight again. We do not ferry slaves, she said, automatic, and then caught herself. We ferry men. Bring them to the quays. You'll keep watch that they don't go to the old ways with knives. They'll keep their word if they're given ground to stand on, Jon said. Then we'll give them some, Yara said. And in return, Jon said slowly, I take on a sea I've never learned to read. We've charts, Yara said. You've woods. I don't know them. I'll trust you not to let me blunder into bogs and groaning men hiding under snow. You trust me not to run you onto rocks. She smiled, small and precise. I don't bed men. If that's what your northern mind is circling, stop it. I won't give you a son between now and morning. I won't give you love in a song's fashion. I'll give you loyalty. I'll give you ships. I'll give you my name where it matters. I'll give you a wedding, and I'll stand beside you in it." Silence moved through the room with a feeling like the tide turning offshore. "You could marry any number of lords' daughters," Davos said after a moment. "Girls who've learned to curtsy to snow. Easier women. Softer. Girls who've learned to curtsy to men who flay their rivals and feed them to dogs," Yara said. "Or to kings who'd burn their own blood and call it faith. I'm not the softer choice, but I'm the choice that makes Euron feel like his mouth's full of ash. Something like humor, dry, thin as birch bark, touched Jon's mouth. I find I like that thought. Yes." Yara spread her hands. "Picture it for me. I enjoy imagining his face at the notion of me. Married to a wolf and wearing a crown." Manderly laughed. Davos didn't, but the corners of his eyes creased in a way that felt like permission. Jon said, "If we do this, the North will howl." "Let it," Yara said. "Better a howl than silence." He looked at her for a long time, and she saw in that look a measure she recognized from captaincy, the weighing of anchors and weather, of men's tempers and the shape of the coast. Then he nodded once. "We forge it," he said. "We'll bargain terms, but we forge it." The hall exhaled. Manderly took a step forward and clapped his hands together as if to wake the stones. Davos let out his breath. Theon made a small sound, not quite relief, not quite despair. Yara picked up the thread of her own breath again, realizing she'd dropped it. "Then the first term is this," Jon said, voice steady but not iron-hard. "No Ironborn shall raid the North while I draw breath. No houses on the stony shore burned. No fishing boats taken. No children sold for salt wives. Any man who breaks it answers to me." Yara inclined her head. "Done. You'll return Deepwood Motte if you hold it. I will take it first and return it. You'll ferry my folk and theirs. And when this is over, if any of us are left, you'll stand in public for them and say they're men, not game. Done." Yara's mouth had gone dry. "And you'll name me as you've said. You'll lend Winterfell's voice when the Ironborn gather. And if we win the Isles, if a crown is set upon me, you'll recognize it." "I will," Jon said. He hesitated, then let the last words fall like a stone dropping into water. "And I'll marry you under the heart tree, if you'll be married there. And on the deck of my ship." Yara shot back, the taste of victory new and hot. "Let your tree watch and my sea listen. We'll have both. Let the gods argue it out between them while we do our work." "That's 2 ceremonies," Davos said. "I'll need 2 sets of boots if I'm standing up at both." "Bring 3, Yara said. "Someone will spill wine." That night White Harbor lit lanterns along the quays, and men drank without songs that insulted each other's gods. The Manderly kitchens sent out platters of smoked trout like silver tongues and bowls of stew so thick a spoon stood up in it. Theon sipped salt-sour ale and felt the weight of eyes on him. Manderly men who'd lost kin to the Dreadfort, Ironborn who'd followed him to betrayal and back to a kind of breath. He kept his gaze on his hands. The knuckles were different now. Bone had grown back crooked. He could read them like a map, each bump a place where he had lived in a room with no windows. "Stop counting them," Yara said low. She sat beside him, legs wide as if she still stood braced in a swell. "If you have to count something, count what's left." "What's left?" Theon asked, not bitterly. He didn't even feel up to the dignity of bitterness anymore. 2 fingers for Euron, 1 ear for Ramsay, for toes for the stranger who waited at my bedside and let me get away again. "You've your breath," Yara said. "You've your name. If these Northerners give it back to you, not that you deserve it, you'll take it and not break it again. You'll go to Deepwood with me, and you'll tell Lord Glover he can spit on whoever he likes as long as he takes his castle back. You'll stand the line when Euron comes. That's what's left." "It sounds like a lot," Theon said, and rubbed a finger at the line where his ear should have been. "It is," Yara said. "That's the point." Jon did not come to the feast. Yara saw him briefly on a balcony when a horn sounded from the outer wall. He stood alone, hands on the stone, while the city steamed under lanterns and breath. She waited for him to look down, to flag her to him. He didn't. He seemed to be reading the snow's white script. By morning, the pact had a name and the weight of men's gossip. Someone christened it the Salt and Snow. A clever boy, that one. The phrase moved as fast as any sea rumor. Yara left the city at first light with 3 merman galleys and a cluster of fat-bellied traders laden with flour, woolens, and salt pork. Behind her, the white knife narrowed into a throat of river and mud flats. South of them, the sea lay flat and hard. The wind smelled metallic, as if it had been dragged over iron. They made landfall north of the stony shore and cut inland for Deepwood Mott with 200 ironborn on foot, and as many Northmen as Manderley had been able to scrape from his keys. Lord Glover's men found them 3 miles from the walls, hungry and burned from a season spent hiding in copses and hunting in their own woods. Robert Glover met Yara under furs heavy with snow. He had a face like a closed fist. When he saw Theon, the fist clenched tighter, then opened in something like surprise, then not quite contempt. It took skill to break a man and still leave him shaped enough to recognize. "You brought me thieves," Robert Glover said. "I brought men who can climb your walls in winter and slip knives in places the Boltons don't put armor," Yara said. "Do you want Deepwood back? Or do you want to keep inventing names for the hurt you've been nursing?" Glover stared at her. He had the silence of the deep woods in him. "You'll give it back. I came to put you in it. And what do you want in return? My daughter? My oath? A new name carved on my gate. I want your tongue in any hall that speaks my name," Yara said. "I want you to say we kept our word. If we do. If we don't, you can tell men that too. And I want your men to stand for Jon Snow when the North is called. He married me for this. Don't make it be for nothing." Robert Glover's eyes moved to Theon like a blade. Theon dropped his gaze first. "I came to tell you I have the size of what I did," he said. "It won't fit in words." "No," Glover said. "It won't." They took Deepwood Mott at dusk. Yara led the first into the ditch, snow up to her thighs. Her breath hitting her face and freezing like tears she refused to call tears. She twice fought an Ironman played in cold so cold it rang. But she left the weight to men she could not trust not to slip. She wore leather over boiled wool and moved like a blade under a sleeve. The sentries had grown complacent. Winter made fools of men who trusted fires to keep them awake. They died quietly. Yara felt more pity than triumph when the last of them slid into the snow with a hiss and went still. They opened the gate from within. Robert Glover entered like a man walking into a room he'd been keeping for a dead wife. He touched the stones, and his face cracked, not with laughter or fury, but with something bald and raw like wind on a scar. "My father's hall," he said. "My father's. You'll keep it," Yara said. "If you don't, I'll take it again and put it on better legs." Robert's mouth twisted. He lifted his gaze to her. "You keep your word," he said, and it sounded like it had taken him a great deal to pull the sentence out of himself. "I'll keep mine." "You'll need men for the feasts to come," Yara said, thinking not of tables and flags but of war. "We'll go on." They did. Deepwood held. The stony shore quieted. Word went ahead of them like the scent of a storm. By the time Yara's column turned east for Winterfell and the flat white plain around it, houses that had sworn the flayed man were looking at their neighbors with the distrust that opens under men's feet when they realize the ground they have been standing on belongs to someone else. The camp outside Winterfell was a patch of dirty snow and rope which smelled of horses and wood smoke, old leather and old wounds. Tents stood like dull teeth. In the largest of them, under a banner with a gray direwolf, Jon Snow bent over a map with Davos and a woman with hair red as autumn flint. Her eyes were clever and sunless, and Yara recognized the way she held herself. A lady who had learned to sharpen more than her pins. "Sansa Stark," Theon whispered, and the word nearly undid him. His voice was a thread. He did not step forward. He held himself like a man braced against the impact of seeing a ghost. Sansa lifted her head. For a heartbeat, her face had nothing in it at all. Then it was everything. Ash and lavender, firelight and the bare planks of a cold room. She took one step. Theon stepped back. "I remember the boy who lied to save me from the kitchen," Sansa said, in a voice measured like a weaver setting a weft. "And the man who brought monsters to my door. I remember both. You don't get to choose which I keep." "No," Theon said. "I don't." She turned to Yara, and the weight of her gaze could have bent iron. "You would be Lady of the Iron Islands." "I would," Yara said, "if men aren't fools." "They are," Sansa said, "but sometimes they're tired of being fools." "We'll marry," Yara said bluntly, because it was time to say it again, to say it to the person whose opinion was a weather vane in the yard of Winterfell. "Jon and I will put our names together and stand in front of whatever comes with them." Sansa's eyes flicked to Jon. There was affection in that glance, but it had thorns in it. Fierce love can be the sharpest kindness, Yara thought. Sansa reached out, touched her fingers briefly to the map and to the little iron wolf that stood for Winterfell. "If you mean to be part of this, be part of all of it," she said. "We don't have time for half-promises." "I don't make them," Yara said. "Not anymore. We take them at dawn," Jon said without preamble. His voice had gone hoarse with cold and command. "We've lured Ramsay Bolton out onto the plain. We'll try to pull him farther. The moment he overextends, we hit him from both sides. The Ironborn strike the rear. Manderly holds the center. Umbers and Glovers move to cut them." Yara nodded. "My men can run on what they ate last night," she said. "We've boots for the snow. We're used to wind in our eyes." "There'll be arrows enough to grind your teeth on," Davos said. Yara smiled, thin as the chain she wore tucked under her leathers, "and shields to break them on." Ramsay Bolton did not know how to be afraid of an ocean he could not see. He sat a fine stallion and smiled with the mouth of a man who had never loved anything that could run from him. His host came onto the plain in gray light like wolves crossing the face of a pond. Only their breath betrayed them. Jon's line looked thin. It was meant to look thin. His archers held their bowstrings like their own breath. Yara watched the first two volleys from the low rise of a drift, body flat against the snow. Wind worried the hairs of the fur at her throat. Her men crouched in a swale below, their faces blacked with stove soot, their eyes slitted against the glitter off the field. She smelled horses, leather, the old iron stink of blood and steel married for 1,000 years. "Now," she breathed into the horn at her mouth, and her men uncoiled. Ironborn had never loved horses, but they loved momentum. They came fast and low, knives up and shields forward, and the rear of the Bolton line was soft as the belly of some great fish when you turned it. The first men who turned to meet the Ironborn died where they stood. There was no room to turn, and others stumbled over them and fell, and then the panic started to cut through like a rip tide through a shoal of herring. Jon's center held when it looked like it would snap. Davos's voice could be heard, preposterously, calling steady in the chaos, as if he were urging stubborn Flower to rise. Sansa sat her horse beyond the hill with 50 men and did not tremble. Shaggy Dog's memory lay heavy on the air, and Ghost's voice cut the wind once, twice, in a long white disappearance, and then he was among men, red-mouthed and perfect. When the line broke, it broke as all lines do in the end. Suddenly and everywhere. Yara's boots slipped on blood-slick snow. She caught herself and rose into a thrust and felt a man's mail give like wet rope. She dropped him and moved on. Ramsay Bolton wheeled. His men fell back. He lifted his chin like a man sniffing for a new game and dragged at his reins. Jon came from the center like a blade from a scabbard. They didn't meet. The field kept them apart. But Yara saw Ramsay's gaze jerk, saw him notice that somewhere in this white and red chaos was a man who had learned not to flinch. Ramsay's smile looked suddenly like a cut on a piece of meat. He pulled back. He went for the walls. They did not chase him into Winterfell's mouth. Jon wouldn't. Yara watched him rein in, watched his eyes gray, steadier than any dying light, measure the gatehouse's teeth. He waited for ladders and for rams. He waited for the old name of the place to remember itself. The gate opened when the men inside who called themselves Bolton men realized the gate had remembered. They poured out to drop their knives and their pretenses. Ramsay was found in the kennels. Yara stood at a distance, in the smell of old straw and worse, and did not go nearer. She did not need to know how that ended. Enough had been made of dogs and boys. She had her own ghosts. She chose not to feed them, not tonight. That night in the great hall, before any coronations or declarations or even the washing of the floor, John stood up slowly. He was not drunk. He was never drunk, Yara suspected. Men who had died and come back wore their drink differently. He looked at his sister, who looked back at him like a shoreline. He looked at Davos, who nodded once, as if checking a knot. He looked at Theon, who could not bear it and did anyway. And then he looked at Yara. "If there is a north left in spring," he said, in a voice that made the hammers in the yards fall quiet, "it's because of vows we kept in winter. Tonight I'll take one more. Yara Greyjoy, stand with me." Yara stood. She did not smile. Her heart beat hard and slow like a drum at sea. "Tomorrow under the heart tree," John said, "and at the river mouth under your god. We'll tie this knot and see if it holds. The north needs ships. The isles need a shore. We make a bridge between them." Sansa's mouth curved, not unkindly. The hall hummed. Men murmured to each other in the rising and falling music of 100 small hopes. "Then tomorrow," Yara said simply. Her throat felt scraped with wind. They wed in a dawn so harsh the frost on the heart tree's leaves looked like they would cut anyone who dared touch them. The gods would steamed with the breath of men and horses. Snow fell in tight small spirals that looked private, as if the flakes had secrets and would whisper them when they landed. The weirwood was older than the story of men. Its face had been carved in a century when knives were stone and vows were as simple as hunger. A maester might have scoffed at calling that a face, but anyone who had ever looked into the belly of a storm recognized it. John laid the flat of his palm against the bark. He did not pray aloud. Yara didn't either. She had come to too many bargains with gods she did not trust to put her words in front of strangers. But she had taken salt on her tongue as a girl and had handed drowning men into the arms of the priests and had felt the breath slither out of them like a fish. The gods were listening whether or not she spoke. "No singers, no perfumed bows." Davos stood to one side like a stump in a gale that would not go. Sansa on the other, her cloak furred in white. Manderly had a frost-crusted feather in his cap. Theon stood under the branches like a boy afraid to be seen at a feast. Ghost sat, white and old as the day, and did not blink except when the wind shifted. John took Yara's hand. It fit like the wooden grip of a tiller, calloused, personal, not pretty, perfect for a work a person could love. "We do this as commanders," he said softly, the white breath of it drifting between them. "As leaders, as two standing for more than themselves." "We do," Yara said, just as soft. And then, because she was iron-born and had always hated a sheepish thing, she said louder, "And if any god wants it prettier, he can do the work of it himself." Sansa's laugh cracked the cold. They had done the private speaking at dawn, when the godswood was still black and gray. Yara had said, "I won't bed you. I won't give you an heir unless we think of some trick to cheat life into listening to us, and I won't promise to try that." John had said, "I don't want you to." He had said it like a man grateful to be spared a shame. They had spoken of heirs and names and the cleverness of maesters who, when called upon to do a thing they claimed could not be done, often remembered a way to do it if you paid them well and did not ask them to preach about it. Yara had said, "We might adopt." She had thought of Theon and had not said his name. John had said, "There are children enough who might die without names. We will save some. That will be our heirs." And Yara had thought, "Here is a man I can keep says and put it in the same pocket with mine." After the heart tree, they went down to the white knife's mouth. The sea was hard as hammered pewter. Waves moved under the crust of new ice like beasts sleeping. Crewmen spread sand on the deck of the black wind lest someone go down and split his head open with a wedding bottle in hand. Yara's priests had flat eyes and tangled hair and wore weeds like banners. They cut their hands, and the blood dripped into a wooden bowl with salt water in it, and the steam rose thick and smelled like coins. Yara offered the bowl to John. He put a finger to the surface. The blood clouded like a storm losing its shape, and Yara thought, "What is dead may rise in another way." The dunes above the quays filled with men with spyglasses. The smell of fear went before the fleet like a bow wave. Yara climbed to the watch, cloak belled full of wind, hair stinging her cheeks. She raised the glass and set her jaw against the swell and looked at the cut-and-slash canvas with its tattered black wings. Euron had come like a crow to a new kill. He did not come at night. That would have been too subtle. He came at midday with the sun behind him, because men who have no fear seek to make others blind. He had lashings of bright cloth on his masts, flags that meant nothing except that he'd taken a pile of other men's flags. He had 50 ships, maybe more. The line of them undulated to the horizon. Between them were galleys the size of houses and swift longships with hulls like wet knives. White Harbor had ships, too. Manderley had kept them painted and provisioned through years when he had only used them to chase off smugglers. They were not ironborn lean, but they were stout and had crews who had spent their boyhoods on the white knife. The river taught men patience and math. The sea taught speed and appetite. Yara intended to make those educations speak to each other. Jon met her on the quay. His cheeks were raw in the wind. He wore no crown. He had a cloak on that had once belonged to someone who had died protecting Winterfell. It smelled of pine and smoke and old oaths. "He's early," he said. "He's late," Yara said. "We've been waiting for this since my father fell off a bridge." "You think he fell?" "He fell like a man." Manderley's flagship, the Merman's Kiss, had a broad deck and a forward castle like a pig houdel. Earned to dance. Yara found herself liking it despite its gracelessness. On the main deck, ladders lay coiled. On the yardarms, boys perched like pale gulls waiting for wind. Manderley came to greet her in a shorter cloak than his usual. He dressed sense to his station. "You've captains with you?" Yara asked. "Half a dozen with a brain each and a dozen who share one," Manderley said, almost cheerful. He was never happier than when being asked to do something for which the world had told him he was too fond of pies. "What do you need beyond ships and a fat man to shout at them?" "Fire," Yara said, "but not in barrels. We'll have no wildfire tricks. Pitch, tar, anything that sticks. Nets, hooks. And do you still have the old fisherman's gate chains?" Manderley's eyes brightened. "We do. Then we make a harbor into a bowl," Yara said. "We let Euron drink. We break the rim." The plan was simple and not. Good plans are like that. They laid heavy chain under the water mouth of the harbor and tied it to anchors set in mud where men had dug in hotter months. They left a gap where cunning could be tempted. Manderley's galleys made themselves into a stupid mouth, heavy and open. The iron-born ships Yara had brought slipped like knives where the water ran under the stone of the new castle's lee, tucked from sight. Boys whose feet had barely grown into their boots ran lines between decks like spiders under house beams. They coated nets with tar and twisted nails into them like teeth. Euron came laughing. Yara couldn't hear it, but she could see it in the way his masts threw their flags, in the tilt of his prow. She could imagine his eye. She had felt that eye since she was a girl, and he had called her clever, and she had understood he meant she could be useful. He took the bait. He always had. The first rank of his ships came fast. The Merman's Kiss fainted clumsily, as if weighed down by its own belly. Euron sent 4 longships darting toward the harbor mouth to snap at this pig, to hamstring it. They didn't see the chain. Men on water don't look down unless they have learned to fear drowning again. The first ship's keel snagged. The second could not stop. The third tried to veer and drove her beam into the second. And the fourth halted like a man's breath when he realizes his joke has gone too far. The chain lifted under them like a thing alive and cold. It held. "Now," Yara breathed, and the tarred nets flew. They fell like night. Nails bit and clung and sang on iron. Men shrieked. Yara did not listen. She had learned not to. She trained her eye on the bigger ships behind the first line and on the open sea where the rest of Euron's fleet hovered, waiting to see which way the wind blew. They had always waited for him to tell them what to do. Give a man his will long enough and he forgets to look at the sky. "Manderley," she said, "make him look down." The Merman's Kiss came about with the weird grace of a drunk remembering how to dance. Her oars hit the water in a row that made beautiful, stupid music. She drove forward with a sound like a barn door tearing free. The ram wasn't a proper bronze beak. It was an iron-reinforced plank with spikes hammered through it by a smith with a sense of humor. It bit the third longship at the chain and split it like a log. Salt and blood and would rain down. Men fell into the water. They went down because the chain did not let the wreckage drift. They went under the broken planks and came up slower than the cold. Euron's flagship, the Silence, hung back, sails fat with January wind. Yara raised her glass and saw her uncle's face as if he stood before her. His mouth always too red, his smile always too easy. He had one eye, and in it a world that belonged to him already. He didn't blow a horn. He didn't need to. He looked left. 3 ships peeled. He looked right. 5 more. He sent them not at Yara's net and chain, but at the galleys beyond, the city's belly. He meant to make them drop the chain to save their homes. He had not met the Manderleys. The merman's kiss oddly straightened, as if sworn to some discipline of a slimmer vessel. Men on her decks hauled on ropes that made the air sing. The chain groaned but did not fall. Galleys behind her bore in with their own oars combed tight to the swell. A landman likes to say a harbor is safe. Men who know water know a harbor is simply a place where you can choose how you die. Yara chose for Euron. Iron-born ships that had come with her exploded from the lee of the new castle like fish from under a rock when a predator is not as clever as he hopes. They went for the flanks of the boats Euron had sent toward the city. Young Harag's little spear tip of a longship slipped under a bow and came up alongside like a blade sliding into ribs. Ralph Kenning, cruel, competent, steady, hooked 3 ships with 1 net and smiled like a man who had just found his lost knife. Theon, pale and still, stood at the stern of the Harlaw girl with his hand on the tiller and his gaze on the tide lines. He saw the way the water moved around the Silence as if it were alive. He remembered that Euron always sent other men first. He remembered that you use the tide or it uses you. He took his ship not where pride would put it, but where a small rush of current had begun to set against the flagship starboard. He shouted. The men heard and shoved their oars, and the Harlaw girl went sideways like a crab, scooting into a space a bigger ship would never have thought to fit. Theon squinted into the spray and the smoke and the wind. He lifted his hand and brought it down like a knife. A tarred net arced. It hit the Silence's own hanging rigging and stuck with the tenacity of need. Men on the Silence cursed and hacked, and some laughed, because laughter is a thing you can do when you don't know you've been trapped yet. The net held, and then another fell, and then a third from the other side. Theon had cut the angle perfect. Neither could be shaken without snarling the lines, and the lines could not be cut without dropping a sail into the water to drag and drown the ship like a living thing. Euron didn't laugh then. Yara saw him. He stood at the prow and looked over the side as if he could stare this problem into going away. Then he looked up and saw, across water heavy with struggling men and broken wood and water black with pitch and the white grief of ice, his niece standing on the merman's kiss, face bare to the cold, hair stuck to her lips. He lifted his hand. He put 2 fingers to his brow in a salute that was a threat. Yara touched her forehead once, crude as a dockside boy, and then pointed downward like she was pushing a man's head under. The chain came up on one side on a long groan. Euron's 4th rank, rushing in to be glorious, saw a safe gap and flew for it. It looked good. It always looks good. A trick. The line of chain sank and then rose. The 4th ship's keel caught it. The white knife has mud in its mouth. It sucks hard. The chain stuck fast to the mud again, and the ship hung like a gull on a hook. The 5th ran into it. The 6th drove its weight on the 2 like a man trying to force a door with his shoulder and breaking his clavicle. The Silence moved. The nets pulled at her. The drag cost her. She came like a stubborn truth anyway. Theon swore and hauled until his shoulders shook. Ralph Kenning's crew pulled too, men straining in a line, faces purpling with need. The tar held, nails bit deep. The Silence's bow crunched. One of her sails slackened like a man losing his courage. Euron made a choice. He did not look at his men. He looked at Yara, and his mouth moved in what might have been a song. Then he cut his anchor rope clean and let his ship fall sideways into the fast water. He tore free, not of the net but of his position, giving ground like a wave that drags you off your feet. He blew one short blast on a battered horn. His fleet, infuriatingly disciplined in that, began to pull back just enough to get out from under the chain and the nets and the stupid fat galleys with their pig dances. He was not beaten, not yet. He did not know the taste enough to swallow it. He hauled the Silence level with another of his ships and clambered across like a man made of joints with no bones. He cut the other ship's captain without bothering to speak to him first. He turned and came back. "Again," Yara said. "Brace. Again." They held and they paid. Men fell into the water and did not come up. Manderley took a scar across the cheek that looked like a smile made by a man with no love in him. Theon's hands bled from rope burns. Yara got a splinter of iron in her upper arm and left it in because a fight is no time to make yourself in pieces. By dusk, Euron had pulled back beyond the harbor mouth and lay there, black sails cocked, watching. He was not a man to go away. He was a man to wait until a different trick looked like a better trick. Yara stood with her chin up and felt the bruise of victory in her bones, that ache a dancer knows when she has not fallen. She went ashore when the light was almost gone, wind knifing her ears and cheeks. Jon was on the quay as steady as the pilings. He had not moved from that spot, or perhaps he had moved and simply returned to stand as if he had not. When he saw her, he did not speak. He did not open his arms. He did not ask for an accounting. He reached out and took hold of her elbow with a careful hand, steady as the hand a man offers another on a pitching deck. "You held," he said. "So did your fat lord," Yara said, and laughed, a cracked and true laugh. "He's a good sailor for a man who keeps butter near his bed." "Wyman keeps everything near his bed," Jon said, and Yara almost smiled at the shock of humor rising like a bubble in cold water and not bursting. "We'll do it again," Yara said, quieting. "He'll come back. He'll think he can dead reckon his way through me and eat your city in 2 bites. He's wrong. We'll see to it." "And then?" Jon asked. "And then we go north," Yara said. "If they'll still have us. Your wildlings." "They will," he said. "There are still some to have." They went. Euron came twice again, and twice again he was turned away. He learned, and they learned that he learned. He set fires and threw broken oars and dead men into their harbor, and they hauled them out with nets. He sailed east along the Bight and came back with new scars and new jokes. The third time a blizzard blew in, a real one with a mean streak, and both sides lay to and did not fight and simply survived, which is the cruelest battle and one neither side ever wins. When the wind broke, Yara and Jon stood together on the wall and looked at the sky. Over the sea, the snow had fallen like sifted flour. Over the land to the north, beyond the river mouth, a line lay on the horizon that did not move like weather. "That's not a storm," Jon said. "No," Yara said. "I've known storms. They argue when they come. That's a march." The ships were ready in 3 days. The Manderley galleys prowled like well-fed hounds. The iron-borne longships were leaner than they had been, and their men leaner still in their faces after a winter in a northern city that had not loved them and that they had not raided. Yara stood at the prow, and Theon stood at her shoulder, and Jon stood on the deck as if the boards were ice under his feet. Hardhome was a word and a scar and a place where gulls had learned to name the dead. They went anyway. The first sight of it knotted Yara's gut. Smoke, old and new. Black edges to snow where someone had burned something that did not like to burn. A beach like a mouth full of broken shells. Men and women and children stood in clots on the strand. They had faces that had seen too many winters in one winter. "We don't have room," a Manderley lieutenant said, frightened, practical. "Make it," Yara said. "People are not logs. They stack differently." They took T.H.M. aboard until the ships sat lower in the water than Prudence liked. The onshore wind helped them back off the beach like a hand on their shoulders. Men on the strand pushed until their boots were full of freezing water and then climbed the nets like spiders whose legs had remembered how to work at last. Children were passed chain by chain like bowls of warm soup. An old woman with hair white as the day and eyes bright enough to light a room clasped Yara's wrist and said something in a language Yara did not know and then patted her hand as if she were the child. "Move!" John shouted hoarse. "Move! Don't look back." They didn't look back until a cry went up like a gull had been cut open by a wave. Yara turned despite herself. The line on the horizon had opened its mouth and something had come out. It was men that weren't men and wolves that weren't wolves and a cold that cracked wood at a touch. They did not run so much as fall forward without stopping. The first of them reached the place where the last of the living had been standing a moment before. "Archers!" Davos barked from somewhere. He had come, damn him. His voice found its way on the wind as if it had its own compass. Archers. Flame did not frighten them, but it slowed them. The first arrows landed with the small, resigned sound an arrow makes when it knows it has done its best and the world remains stubborn. Yara's men hauled on the lines until blood ran from their palms. John was everywhere at once, or so it seemed. He shoved a boy up a net and then turned with a blade in his hand, and when it met a white blade it sounded like a bell rung underwater. A gust of wind came off the mountains like a god had exhaled lazily, perhaps amused. The sea chopped. The black wind lifted and dropped and backed. The merman's kiss groaned. Men fell. Men rose. Yara planted her feet and reached down and caught a girl by the back of her rag-wet shift and hauled her over the side with a grunt that sounded like her father's when he had pulled a net full of fish into a boat twice too small. The girl coughed and glared at her as if Yara had interrupted a story. Yara laughed, short and unkind and so relieved it hurt. A figure stood on the ridge a long ways off, and all at once the air remembered how to be knife-sharp. John looked up. So did Yara. The figure lifted a hand. Men who had died without breath in their chests drew it again with a rattle that sounded like greed. They rose where they had fallen. They came on. The ships were half a bowshot off and then, mercifully, more still. Arrows slowed. Some dropped. The sea took them. The silence of 1,000 breaths held for too long. And then the sound ship men love came up under their feet again. The run of water clean along the hull unhindered. They had saved as many as they had room for. It was not enough. It was never enough. It was more than would have lived if they had not come. On the return run, Yara stood quiet with her hand on the mast. The wind moved like a patient thing along her cheek. Theon came to stand beside her. He had blood in his hair. He looked taller, which was odd because the deck had not grown. "I had forgotten," he said. "What?" "That sometimes you pull men into boats instead of throwing them out." "You did both," Yara said gently. "I did," he said. "I'll spend it, as long as I get to keep spending it." "You will," Yara said. "If you live." "If I live," he agreed, and surprised her by smiling. "That's the trick, isn't it?" They came back to White Harbor at dusk 3 days later. The sky a bowl just cracked at the lip so the last of the light leaked out. The city cheered, not with the sound of conquest, but with the sound a house makes when a family that has been standing in the yard comes in at last. Fires appeared along the quay, careful ones, contained in braziers and rings of stone. Men held their hands out to them like men who had learned what heat was for again. Yara stepped off the gangplank and felt the earth under her boots and thought, as she had thought when she was 12 and had first stood on land for days in a row. This doesn't move. It should be a comfort. It never had been. She had married land. She would have to learn to like being held. John met her with a face that had learned a new grief and did not resent the learning. He put his hand out. She took it. They stood like that while men around them cried and spat and clapped each other and collapsed, quietly, onto the stones and slept. "That thing on the ridge," Yara said. She had not meant to say it, but it came out. "I've seen him before," John said. "And I'll see him again. You think he cares about our little river chain tricks?" "He doesn't," John said. "But he'll come to the river anyway. He'll come to the sea. He'll freeze the harbor and walk across, if that's what the sky lets him do." "Then we warm the water," Yara said. "With fire and bodies and anything else we've got. We make him pay for every step." John turned to her. His eyes had the light a wave gets when the sun is right behind it. "We will." They stood for a while, breathing. Yara could taste smoke and salt and the thin iron of her own blood. She could taste the bruise of a kiss she had given a man she did not love and a luck she had borrowed from gods she did not trust. She could feel the circle of metal on her head like a story's end and beginning pinned to her hair. She could feel the sea behind her, patient as hunger. Sansa came then, cloak blown back, hair braided tight. She looked at the people coming off the ships and at the people on the quay who were there to catch them. She and Yara exchanged a glance that had more in it than most speeches. Sansa nodded once, regally, practically. Yara nodded back. "Supplies are where?" Yara asked, to have the right word in her mouth instead of the wrong ones. "In the tunnels," Sansa said. "Warmed, guarded, counted twice. Wyman insists on the last. He doesn't UST his own fingers and wants the numbers to agree with themselves." "They rarely do," Yara said. "But I like that man anyway." "He likes you," Sansa said. "He says your language is efficient." "My men say it's obscene," Yara said. "But they don't argue with results." Sansa looked at Jon. There was a storm of things she could have said. She chose only one, and that one sensible. "Rest. Then we go to the crypts." "To count the dead," Jon said. "To remember the living," Sansa corrected. "It makes the counting easier." They went that night. The crypts of Winterfell breathed like an old beast at rest. Candles smoked and made the hair inside Yara's nose itch. The Stone Kings and Queens looked down with a patience that was not benign. It was simply endless. Jon moved among them like a child in a barn, counting the true and secret animals with his fingers. He stopped at one and touched the stone softly. "My mother," he said. So quiet Yara nearly missed it. She did not ask which one. It was not her story to pull tight. She stood in the cold with him until the candle burned half down and the wax ran like tears and stiffened. She did not offer him comfort because he did not ask for it. She gave him silent company and left him before he wanted to ask her to. That was her gift. Knowing when a man needed an empty room. In spring, if it came, there would be songs. They would get all the details wrong. They would say Yara Greyjoy loved Jon Snow and that she had speared Euron from atop a mast and that Sansa Stark had blessed their union with tears of joy and that the merman's kiss had been a swan with silver feathers. They would lie like songs always lie to make life palatable to men who have not bled into snow and have no intention to. Yara would not mind. She had done what she had set out to do. She had made a pact that was a knot and had pulled on it and it had held. She had taken a man who spoke to gods she didn't trust and bound her drought and his winter into one rope. She had put her ships where men told her they should not go and had learned. Again, the shape of a harbor in a storm. She had kept her word. Though she did not say it where anyone could hear, she was proud. In the small hours before dawn, she stood on the wall with Theon and watched a fox cut a V through the snow below as if it were a boat. The stars were hard. The sky was black as a good iron pan. The wind was a hand on her neck, sometimes gentle, sometimes not. "How long?" Theon asked. "As long as it takes," Yara said. "We might die," Theon said, with no self-pity in it, only curiosity. "We will," Yara said. "Eventually. Probably not in a bed if we keep working like this." Theon thought about that and smiled. "Good." Yara laughed softly. The sound blew thin and far. She set a gloved hand on the stone and felt it hold steady. It was not a ship. It would not rock. She would have to be the rocking in this marriage, the movement. Jon would have to be the stern, the sea and the snow, the pact. The word made flesh in timber. She could do that. She had done harder with less. Behind them, inside the wall and inside the larger wall of the city, and the still larger imagined wall men had in their heads when they said words like home and north and free and God. Jon slept for an hour with his sword near his hand and did not dream. The wind tugged at the banner of the direwolf on the tower, then dropped it again. The sea answered, at a distance, with a slow raised hand of wave glimmering under the moon. Between the two, on a string of stone and hope running along the white knife, Yara and Theon stood until their cheeks burned, until they could no longer feel their ears, until the horizon paled a little, which in winter is all you get. Then they went down where the work was, into the rooms with smoke and maps and bread. When men speak of pacts, They speak of words and rings and signed papers and gods. They do not often speak of what comes after. Counting, carrying, waiting, holding, hauling, forgiving and not forgiving, and doing it again. They do not sing of the lifting of a chain with hands already raw. They do not sing of the moment when a woman who will never be soft puts her palm on a man's shoulder and the man, not needing softness, takes the strength as the only right form of love he is allowed right now. They will sing of it anyway in the fashion of songs. They will remember everything wrong and in doing so write another kind of truth. What matters is that the pact held. That in a winter where gods seemed indifferent and monsters were meticulous, two people stood up and said, "Mine. My people, my water, my trees, my word." That when the sea froze at the edges and the river steamed and men took up stakes and moved gods to new corners, Yara Greyjoy and Jon Snow forged a marriage and made for themselves a single blade from two different steels. Winter does not last forever, though it lasts longer than any wish. Storms do not break because you ask them to. Ships do not steer themselves. Still, morning comes. Came this one. And in it, men ate bread beside men they had once called enemies and measured out pitch and kept knives sharp and learned the size of their ships and their hearts. And far north on a ridge, a figure looked toward the sea and did not smile, and his breath, when it left him, froze a little as it went. There is always another fight. The work of the pact was not yet done. That was all right. It was made to be used, not admired. The knots in it were strong. The hands that had tied them were stubborn. The sea waited. The snow took note. The world stood a little more upright on its tired legs.